Now, when workers tried to advocate for better working wages and conditions with their employers directly, we start to see a disturbing trend of increasing violence facing labor unions or organized workers who try to push their companies and negotiate better working wages and conditions. Throughout the 1870s into the 1890s, we see these conflicts turn from initially peaceful ones to violent ones over and over again. One of the first major examples of these conflicts escalating into violence is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This strike initially occurred when railroad workers had been given a pay cut by railroad companies, and so they went on strike when these companies refused to restore pay to previous levels. Now, when railroad workers go on strike during this time period, that means the economy essentially grinds to a halt because railroads were the lifeblood of transporting people and products across the United States. When Pennsylvania State Militia tries to force strikers back to work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the ensuing violent clash killed 20 people, and in retaliation, workers set the rail yards on fire, causing millions of dollars in damages. President Rutherford B. Hayes, who had been unwilling to use the army to enforce Reconstruction in the South, was more than willing to send in the U.S. Army to crush the railroad strike in 1877. In 1886, in Chicago, we have the Haymarket bombing. The Haymarket bombing had its origins in an earlier strike the previous year at the McCormick plant. Workers had struck against a wage reduction the company had introduced. And after some negotiations, the strike had been settled in the workers' favor after some initial clashes between workers and private police force, which had been hired by the McCormick plant. In the ensuing year, since that first strike over wages, the McCormick plant had invested in more mechanization, hoping to reduce the number of human workers required. And in 1886, McCormick rejected union exclusivity. So they said that the union could not require workers to belong to it. And this launched another bitter strike in which 4 workers were killed by police. On May 4th, 1886, workers held a rally in Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest the killing of those workers by police. And in this protest, someone launched a bomb. This bomb killed a police officer, and in the ensuing chaos, police started firing randomly into the crowd. The bombing at Haymarket was used to justify rounding up union leaders who the government painted as dangerous radicals who would be willing to use violence to achieve their means. 8 men are put on trial for the Haymarket bombing. 4 of them were executed by hanging. 1 committed suicide during this process. And 3 of them served prison sentences until their sentences were formally commuted or reduced in 1893. Of the 8 men who were accused of carrying out the Haymarket bombing, 7 of them were immigrants, primarily from Germany and the United Kingdom. But one of them, the only native born person to be arrested, was a Confederate veteran from Alabama who had relocated to Chicago to escape persecution not only for his religious views, but also his African American wife. And in the South at this time, interracial marriages were legally not allowed. He ends up being one of the men who was executed by hanging. Now, historians have long wondered, were these people who were put on trial, were they actually guilty of the bombing, or were they just merely sort of scapegoats who were rounded up because of their connections to Union? And the reality is we don't have definitive evidence to argue that any of these 8 were guilty of the bombing. To this date, we still don't know who actually carried out the Haymarket bombing, but certainly these 8 men were targeted because of their ties to unions and to agitation, political agitation on behalf of workers. We see more violence and more use of physical force against workers in Idaho at Coeur d'Alene when the Idaho governor sent militia and federal troops to break a strike by miners. In 1892, one of the largest of these violent encounters happens in Pittsburgh again. The Amalgamated Association, which was a union representing steel workers, struck against Andrew Carnegie's steel plant when Carnegie declared that the plant would not allow union members because he was fed up with demands from his workers to get better pay. The union, in protest of this, blocked the way for strike breakers. So at this time, typically, if you belonged to a labor union and the labor union was on strike, you would picket or protest outside of the company facility. And the way that companies got around this disruption was they hired non-union workers, which were labeled as strike breakers, or workers also called them scabs, to come in so work could continue, so this would not damage the company's profits. The Carnegie Company had hired a private detective / military or police force called the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And when the union tried to block strike-breaking workers from entering the plant, 300 Pinkertons engaged in a battle with the strikers, which left 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons dead. The Pennsylvania governor then gets involved, sending in the state militia to open the plant, and the strike eventually ended in defeat for the workers. Now, you will notice in all of the instances I just mentioned, there is a common theme of either state forces or private forces being hired to subdue workers. So either the Army, in the case of the Great Railroad Strike, state militias, in the case of Coeur d'Alene, police forces, public police forces, in the case of Haymarket, and then private forces in several of these, but most notably Homestead, private agencies like the Pinkertons being used. And labor unions felt that this was very heavy-handed, that this represented the attempts by capitalists to enforce their rights at the expense of the rights of workers. And this prompted a conversation about politics between the capitalists and the working classes, particularly after Haymarket. Many people, after the Haymarket bombing, raised the alarm that this meant that labor unionists were violent, they were extremist, that they were willing to use violence to overthrow not only capitalism, but also the political system. And so we see membership in the Knights of Labor actually decline as there is this belief among mainstream people, stoked by capitalists, stoked by the newspapers at the time, that workers are radicals. And when we look at working class politics, there is some element of radicalism here. For example, there are some in the working class who are anarchists. Anarchists believe that any government is repressive. No matter how limited, any government that exists is repressive and harmful. And so for anarchists, they advocated completely stateless society. And many people were most afraid of anarchists because they didn't want to reform the system. They just wanted the system to no longer exist. And so many people believed that anarchists were more likely to be radical and more likely to use violence to achieve their means. In reality, at this time, the number of Americans who would have identified themselves as anarchists is probably quite small. Obviously, there's no sort of systematic poll or census of are you an anarchist, but this was seen as a relatively extreme political belief. The more popular political belief among workers would have been socialism. Socialism believed that capitalism should be replaced by a system in which the government controls the means of production in order to ensure equality of condition, that everybody has a basic standard of living. You may be familiar with its close cousin, communism. So the idea is that these guys argue that the private ownership of property and production exploits people, is taken advantage of by very few at the expense of the many. And so many workers found this argument appealing. And so socialism becomes an actual political party in the United States. In the early 1900s, the American Socialist Party will actually field a candidate for president, Eugene Debs, in several election cycles that he actually gets a pretty respectable amount of the vote. So for many people, they see this as a less extreme option than anarchism to reform the existing system in a way that will benefit workers. Now, the reality is both anarchism and socialism are seen as a little bit too far for the vast majority of Americans. And in particular, many in the labor movement felt that to openly embrace anarchism or socialism would turn off a lot of mainstream Americans to support workers. And so after the Knights of Labor has this kind of catastrophic um, loss of membership, we start to see many of the people in the labor union movement have a sort of long, hard think about how they got involved in politics. Because prior to this point, the United Labor Party had been formed with the idea to basically be a third party solely dedicated to the rights of workers. And in New York City, they had actually only narrowly lost an election for mayor to a Democratic candidate, Abraham Hewitt. But 1886 is the peak of labor involvement in politics as a distinct group. As there's more of this perception of labor as being radical and violent, the idea of an independent third party solely focused on the rights of workers starts to look like a hard sell. And so for labor organizers especially after Haymarket in 1886, the thought process is not in forming their own kind of workers' party to participate in politics, but instead to try to work within existing political parties like the Republicans and the Democrats to try to push forward the aims of workers, but not have that be the sole focus of that political party. The true period of reform for workers is not going to take place until the end of the 1890s and the beginning of the 1900s with the Progressive Era, but we will start to see more of the working class concerns addressed with a new political movement called populism, which we'll talk about more next time. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.